Welcome to this DW Business Special, asking if it's time that Europe stopped relying on China. Decades of ever closer cooperation have seen supply chains between EU countries and Asia's economic powerhouse become intricately intertwined. China is now the EU's biggest import partner and a major export target for its businesses. But Europe's collapse in relations with Russia has shown how hard such ties can be to untangle. With China and the EU disagreeing about so many things, is it best to begin that process of untangling now? Well, to try and answer that question and many more, I'm joined by our resident China watcher, Clifford Coonan. Clifford, it's lovely to have you in the studio with me. So is that a question that European leaders are having to reckon with now, that they should be beginning to decouple themselves from China?
I think it is a question they're asking. I think they're all asking it, and they're all getting different answers, and they're all asking the same question to varying degrees, which is going to lead to all kinds of confusion when it comes to formulating a common European response. But maybe if we go back a year, and even then you could have asked me this question and I probably would have given the same answer, but it would have been a very, very different scenario, because in the meantime we've had Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which has thrown everything wide open. Suddenly the idea of developing a dependency on an autocratic or authoritarian regime becomes a completely different issue, because you realise this can have massive ramifications, as we've seen with the dependence on Russian energy.
That's what this is all about, right? It's about not having their fingers burnt like they have in just the past few months with Russia, and having to undo all of that energy intermingling between the two.
Exactly. And I mean, there were so many warnings. I mean, with Russia, there were constant warnings saying, be careful, be careful. And with China, people saying, yes, China's a growing market, you have all these things, but you have to be careful, because this is not the same system. You're ideological competitors. We had the EU 2 years ago talking about China as a systemic rival. You know, even then, people have realised this. So there's a lot more caution about it now, but it's even more acute now than it was a year ago.
Well, Clifford, we're sitting here in Berlin, so let's have a look at one of the countries that is looking long and hard at its relationship with China, and that is, of course, Germany. On Friday, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz landed in Beijing, the first Western leader to do so since the start of the global pandemic, and the first to meet President Xi Jinping since he tightened his grip on power at the Communist Party National Congress last month. Now, Scholz urged the Chinese to use their influence to persuade Russia to end its war in Ukraine, but trade relations were also on the agenda, weren't they, Clifford? So let's go back to that. And that meeting, did anything come out of it? We've heard from Scholz and we've heard from Liu Keqiang, excuse me. And did either of them say anything that was surprising, that goes beyond, you know, the diplomatic language we would have expected?
Well, when I lived in China, I covered a lot of these meetings, and in some ways, it closely resembled them. You had the very, very formal language, very traditional approach, not really saying very much. You had the big trade delegation. There were fewer big deals, although we did have an important deal with BioNTech, the German vaccine producer, that they're going to be allowed to sell their vaccines, to provide German expats with their vaccines, because until now, the BioNTech vaccine hasn't been allowed in China. Foreign vaccines haven't been allowed.
Yeah, so the only vaccines that have been used in China so far are homemade, I suppose.
Yeah, so that's a big development. And if they can expand that, because they're also looking to get permission to expand distribution of BioNTech throughout the whole of China, which would be interesting given we have zero COVID there and a big crackdown on that. So they're going to be looking at that quite closely. But
it's interesting that we're talking about decoupling right now, aren't we? But what we've seen in this trip by Scholz to Beijing is actually a deal being struck that actually brings them closer to one another, not actually taking them further apart.
It is. I mean, there is that, but at the moment it's only just these expats. It's only, you know, I'm presuming it's all expats and not just German expats, although there's a lot of Germans.
Yeah, we don't know that yet, do we?
Not exactly, but yeah, there was that. But at the same time, the focus, you know, we had BASF and VW and Adidas and all you know, the old reliables who were always going on these trade delegations, and they didn't produce any trade deals. I'm not really entirely sure what they were doing there beyond, you know, meeting senior leadership, for the sort of the connections element or the networking element. So it was a very different kind. Even though on the surface it looked like the traditional ones that you'd see with Merkel, where she'd arrive up and they'd all assemble in the Kempinski Hotel in Beijing, and it looked a bit like that. But this lasted a couple of hours. They were in and out. The plane which brought them there had to fly out to Korea because they couldn't stay in the country because of quarantine regulations. Everyone was tested twice, except using Chinese tests, which means the Chinese government now has very important biometric data about the travelling delegation, with the exception of Olaf Scholz, who was tested by a German army doctor. Oh, really? So while it was in some ways similar to previous trade delegations, it was very, very different.
And different to other trade delegations is that we now have the rising tensions in Taiwan as a backdrop to this. There's also, of course, other differences between Germany and Beijing regarding, for example, the treatment of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. Has any of that come up over the past days with Scholz in Beijing?
Well, Scholz, when he was going to China, his partners were very angry in a way that he was going there. The French were annoyed. The US was annoyed, particularly because in the run-up he sold a chunk of Hamburg port to the Chinese state shipper COSCO. That had annoyed people. So there was a lot of ill feeling heading into this, and a belief that Scholz wouldn't address these hot-button issues that you're talking about because they're politically sensitive, and there's always a fear that if they do address these, that they'll be punished in trade terms. And we've seen that happen with Lithuania, which set up closer trade ties with Taiwan, and they've been punished severely by China. But in the end, Scholz did address them. The Chinese didn't really mention them. They sort of said, we have our differences, and they left it at that. But Scholz, in the press conference afterwards, did say, yes, we addressed them. So that was a surprise on one level. But still, there's a feeling that keeping the economic path straight and narrow is still very much a focus here.
It certainly seems to be the case for Olaf Scholz, but there are other members of his government. I mean, he's in a coalition that have taken a slightly different tone. Let's have a listen to another member of his own government, because as Chancellor Scholz headed to China, his foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, gave a rather more frank assessment of German relations with Beijing, I think it's fair to say. Speaking on the fringes of a G7 meeting, she struck a tone of caution.
We're going to be talking about developments in China today, especially with the aim of avoiding repeating the mistakes we made in the past with Russia. Japan, in particular, as a G7 country, continues to point out how important it is that we accept that China has changed in the last couple of years. It is not just a partner in international issues, but also a competitor and even more a rival in view of its understanding of the international order.
So, Annalena Baerbock talking beyond just Germany there, and we want to talk as well beyond Germany here during this as well. And in Europe, is there a broader feeling beyond just Germany that decoupling should be happening, and is anyone taking further steps than Germany is to do that?
Well, definitely, other countries are being more robust in their dealing with China. In general, the EU has been fairly, particularly Western Europe, has been fairly obedient. But Central Europe, we're seeing a lot more of a robust action from the Czechs, from the Lithuanians, the Baltic countries in particular. There's one thing. It was interesting to see how she mentioned Japan. Japan often gets lost in this. There you have an ideological ally in a way. You have a democratic country. You have Korea as a democratic country. We've had 3 years of a pandemic, during which time you could have... Decoupling always sounds like a bit of a wrench to me, whereas what it is more of a focus is you can keep China, but you also need to diversify. You need to look at other markets. You need to look at Japan. You need to look at Southeast Asia. You need to look at places like Korea. And I don't really sense that opportunity has been seized. Now, I know it's obviously
so
really
the opportunity you're referring to there is to work with countries that share more of your values, therefore you don't have the sort of situation that you suddenly have with Russia.
Exactly. I don't really feel that there's been enough of a focus. I know it's been very difficult to do business the last 3 years, but there's been plenty of opportunities to do Zoom calls, as we know. For example, I think they could have made more of an effort. I think Europe could have made more of an effort to look at the other allies in the region and try and build, find its sort of ideological allies and build trade that way.
I think we should just look at why Germany might be a little more reluctant than others to disengage with China, to get an idea of what's at stake when it comes to Germany and its trade relationship with the Chinese. Let's look at how big a role Chinese markets actually play in German imports and exports. As you get to see here, China is Germany's biggest single partner when it comes to combined import and exports. €250 billion last year, ahead of close neighbours, the Netherlands, right on their doorstep, and of course the world's biggest economy, the United States. So, Clifford, is China too big a partner to lose for Germany? Is it already too far gone?
I mean, this is a big question. I myself think it's going to happen sooner or later because with the rate at which technology transfer is happening, China doesn't want necessarily German cars. It wants German quality cars built in China. That's an old example, I suppose. But also the Chinese economy, I know there's, as you pointed out, it's a big factor, but it's not looking as good as it did even 3 or 4 years ago. It's got a real problem. The zero COVID thing means that, you know, we saw these pictures from Foxconn the other day, the world's biggest iPhone factory, where everyone was just leaving, which means you're going to have supply chain issues. So it's not as reliable. It's not as attractive as it used to be. There's a lot more. Under Xi Jinping, he's just been voted in for an unprecedented third term. He's very unlikely to want to introduce reforms that favour foreign companies. He's going to introduce regulations that favour the Communist Party and that favour the domestic market. That's going to be his priority. So sometimes I think decoupling is portrayed, or disengagement is portrayed as something that we decide, but actually this is a two-way thing too.
Yeah, that's something we should definitely talk about. We should flip this around and ask whether there are any thoughts in Beijing about whether or not it should be decoupling from Western nations that don't share its ideals.
I think there is that way of thinking, particularly when it comes to domestic issues like some of the ones you've mentioned, like Tibet, like Taiwan. Tibet is another one. The origins of the the coronavirus virus. Which we've seen where they basically decoupled from Australia to a large extent because they feel, well, if you're not going to go along with our message, we don't have to trade with you. So that's going to happen more and more as China's economic, because it's such a strong economic power. We've seen it do this in Lithuania. We've seen all kinds of threats. There was even threats to Germany at various points over the years saying, if you don't play ball, you know, so that's a form of disengagement from the other side and sort of saying that you can no longer lord it over us, which is understandable, obviously, for a developing country because it feels that, you know, these Western countries have had it their own way for very long. But on the other hand, the ideologies are extremely different and it becomes an issue of whether, you know, you want a democratic system or an autocratic system.
Who does it replace? Those countries, like if it were to, you know, to loosen ties with Europe, who does it replace them with? Is it Russia? Is it adversaries of the people that it was previously trading with, or is that too provocative? What do you think?
I think you can still trade with, I mean, Russia obviously at the moment is impossible, but I think if there's a regime change in Russia, you know, you're going to see, or if there is eventually, when the Ukraine war ends, we're going to have to come to some accommodation with Russia. The same thing with China. I think a lot of it is just the fact that trade has been happening with no strings attached. You know, that it has to happen in a sort of in an ethical way, if you want. You know, that you have to, if you're going to buy cotton from Xinjiang, it can't be made by forced labour from the Uyghur minorities, for example. There's going to have to be a different way of approaching these countries and saying that we have these values and these values apply to how we do business. And I think that's basically what a lot of this comes down to, and that's quite straightforward.
Well, let's actually hear from the Chinese side of this discussion and get a view from the Chinese government on relations with Germany and with Europe as a whole. Let's hear from Foreign Ministry spokesperson Zhao Lijian.
Developing Chinese-German relations will not only benefit both countries, but also benefit Chinese-European relations and the wider world. China will continue to uphold pragmatic cooperation, mutual benefits, and win-win results, and work with Germany to further develop bilateral relations and contribute more to world peace and stability. Regarding some differences of opinion between China and Germany, Xinjiang-related issues are China's internal affairs. And China's position on these issues is consistent and clear. China's internal affairs are not the concern of external forces.
Yeah, OK. Well, Clifford Coonan, back to you. Decoupling, if it happens, what does it look like?
I think it looks like taking this more ethical approach to business and diversifying into other markets and just reducing dependence. So much of this is a dependency issue. Germany has a dependency issue with Russia, and now there's a dependency issue with China. So decoupling in some ways is almost like a cure, you know, to reduce the dependency where you don't put all your eggs in one basket. I think decoupling is actually quite a sensible approach in some ways. Certainly a high degree of disengagement is a sensible approach in some ways to keep a more even balance of trade.
It's all things in moderation, as we always say. And is it something that takes place suddenly, quickly, or over decades?
I think it's something that will happen over years. I mean, I think it's something that it depends. A lot of it depends on whether Europe can act in unity.
And we've seen with Russia that they're managing to reduce their reliance on Russian energy pretty swiftly, in the grand scheme of things. We're talking a year or two,
Yeah, and I think that could be the same thing. I mean, there's always the issue. I mean, Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine took everyone by surprise, even though we knew it was kind of coming in some way. A lot of people have predicted it. Mm-hmm. Should, say, China invade Taiwan, that would again force these sort of issues and force these decisions. So there could be kind of a black swan event, as they call it. But I still think that it's going to be more, it needs to be a much more sort of holistic approach to how you deal with trade and how you deal with doing business with other countries and bringing back not just focusing on the race to the bottom, but bringing back some real value into the supply chain.
OK, Clifford Coonan, still a lot of ifs on there, but thank you very much for bringing us your insight as ever. That's Clifford Coonan, resident China watcher here at DW. And thanks to Clifford, and also thanks to you for watching this on YouTube. Why not take another look at one of our other business specials from the past few weeks, or also check out our Business Beyond series, which is always worth looking at on the DW News YouTube channel. Until next we meet, though, take care.